Now on to our last panel of the day, which we're very much looking forward to, engaging youth in the future of Egypt. I don't think any conversation about Egypt is complete without talking about this very critical issue. Of course, it's a key issue in every society, the role that youth play. But given the role that Egyptian and Arab youth played in the Arab Spring, it's especially critical that we continue to examine and understand what Egyptian youth are doing and saying to create a better future for themselves. Joining us to lead this discussion is a journalist who spent a lot of time among Egyptian youth covering the Tahrir Square protests. Paul Danahar is currently the BBC America's bureau chief, but previously served as the BBC's Middle East bureau chief, a perch from which he witnessed the Arab uprisings throughout the region, leading to his book, The New Middle East, The Arab World After the Arab Spring. So we're in very good hands with Paul. Paul, I want to thank you for joining us and guiding this panel, and now I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. You can hear me at the back? Okay. If you can't, just shout, and I'll shout back, but we'll get there in the end. Let me take you back a little bit to why we have young people on this panel rather than old people, which is what you normally get on panels when you're talking about the Middle East. At least you used to before we got rid of some of the older guys that were running the Middle East. The morning after Mubarak formally stood down, the angry young men and women, maybe even some of these people here, who'd led the revolution, had been replaced in Tahrir Square by their mothers, who were cleaning up the mess. After weeks of reeking of tear gas, it began to smell of disinfectant. You may have remembered that. The pavement where I had stood with the young revolutionaries, watching them throw stones backwards and forwards at the government yobs, was being fixed by lots of young ladies and their mums, because it was pretty much all the mums doing all the work, if I recall correctly. The day after Tahrir Square changed the world, they were putting all the stones back, and everybody thought, we're rebuilding the pavement, we are rebuilding Egypt. Unfortunately, many of those stones would be dug up again, time and time again, and get thrown around Tahrir Square as Egypt tried to work out what it wanted. But on that day, I remember speaking to a middle-aged woman, and she said to me, it's a young person's revolution. You would see in the demonstrations people with this hippie look, which doesn't apply to any of you, with their hair a little bit too long, particularly the men. And you thought, what are they going to do, this Sisi generation? You can't tell the men from the women. But then look what they did, she said. And she said it with a big beam and a big smile, and I think it reflected the pride that generation of Egypt had in their young people, because they themselves had just basically knuckled down and tried to push back and pretty much failed. And suddenly it was their sons and daughters that had changed everything. And that was probably the high watermark of Egyptian unity. It's been pretty much downhill ever since. The light that burned so bright among many of those young people seems to have been doused by the cold, smothering hand at times of the Egyptian state. So, the kind of questions we want to ask today is, why did you let your mum and dad down so badly? Because they were really quite excited, and they thought you'd changed the world and changed Egypt, and didn't quite go that well, did it, Lina? Actually, I've just remembered, I haven't told them who you are, so I better do that, otherwise you'll think I just dragged her off the street. These are not 4 people dragged from the street. To my left is Lina, Attalah, who is an editor of Mada, the independent online Egyptian newspaper. She was previously the editor-in-chief of the Egyptian Independent until the Scarf decided they didn't like it, and they kind of shut it down. But she still has a job, and she's still telling everyone about the Middle East. Ibrahim El-Houdaiby is next to her. He's not wearing a tie. But that doesn't mean anything. It means he's also a journalist at the al-Shorouk and the Ahram online. Am I right? He writes columns. That kind of makes you a journalist. He's also a former member of the Muslim Brotherhood Youth who left the organisation before the revolution because he wasn't very happy about their lack of reform tendencies, which shows how prescient he is. So we look forward to hearing what he has to say. He's also the grandson of one of its very famous former leaders. So if a name is familiar, there's a good reason for that. Ramy Yaacoub, who is wearing a tie, thank you, Ramy, is the Deputy Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. And before he became an academic, he was very engaged in Egyptian politics, and so we'll ask him whether his presence here today means he's given up on Egyptian politics, like so many other people. And finally, Adel El-Adawy is currently pursuing a PhD at the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. And he's a researcher focusing on civil-military relations in the Arab world and US-Egyptian relations. And there was a few years ago when we didn't think we'd need to have civil-military relations, but now we do, because in Egypt anyway, the military are back running civil affairs, by and large. So, Lina, let me get back to my question, which was, why did you mess up so badly?
All right, so I started off by saying that I wasn't necessarily performing for my parents to let them down. I do not think, I'm very self-critical of what happened in the earlier part of the last 3 years and throughout the last 3 years in terms of our performance, in terms of our inability to organize, in terms of our inability to imagine political alternatives. But also it's important to acknowledge that I still hold a lot of pride for what happened 3 years ago, in the sense that no one would have imagined that we would be able to imagine actually mobilizing to that scale and destabilizing the system to that scale back then. Now, to what end? It's an important question, but I'm not also sure to what extent this could have been planned 3 years ago, given the prevalent condition of oppression under which we've been living. In fact, we managed to come together and to mobilize with very little organizational abilities, and that's something to be studied and discussed. And the effect of destabilization at the very higher echelons of the state is a fact. It happened. Now, we messed up because we could have organized better, definitely, but we also realized the ferocity and the solidity of the state and the system that we are trying to destabilize. So it doesn't take traditional modes of organizing or traditional political tactic to destabilize that state. It's a bigger story there, and if there's anything we've learned from that time is really understanding the depth and the solidity of that state, and the fact that only by imagining a completely different political language and a completely different political alternative, which I don't know what it is.
It's nothing personal.
Like
but in the meantime, because that was a long answer, I'm going to get on to Ibrahim and ask you, Ibrahim. Did you think Egypt would be where it was today when you were hanging around in Tahrir Square thinking you just changed everything for good?
Of course not. At least I didn't hope for that. But I think it's also a very wrong assumption. And it is this initial wrong assumption that takes us all the way in the wrong direction when we say that it was a youth revolution. It was not. It was not a handful of activists who called for a revolution and therefore everybody followed. No, there were very good structural reasons for this revolution to take place. Socioeconomic reasons and political reasons that led to, just look at the last decade, the decade preceding revolution on the socioeconomic changes, on the political occlusion.
But there wasn't a lot of grey hair in Tahrir Square in those days.
Yeah, of course there wasn't a lot of grey hair, but the problem here is that when we assume that it was, when we put aside the structural reasons that have led to revolution and we look at the handful of activists who were there on the street, then you have a brutal regime like the regime we have at the moment. In their minds, in order to preempt another wave of protest, instead of tackling the very same socioeconomic problems that still persist, they are just attacking activists. And which is not only a violation of human rights, a breach of every democratic principle, but also a counterproductive policy.
But how did you get into such a mess? Just after Mubarak fell down, you had real power. Young people had, you can say there were some old people floating around, but you young people had real power. Everybody was scared stiff of you.
Yeah, because there is this institutional deficit from which we have been suffering from day one, between very strong, well-organized, but very conservative political forces, be it within the state or within the conservative opposition of the time, which then became the new regime, on the one side, and very progressive, radical, nonetheless poorly organized political actors. More revolutionary actors were much less organized, and therefore at a moment of volatility you can actually play a role, but when things start calming down, if you do not have a strong institution, then you do not have a place.
Ramy, you were heavily involved in trying to build up a political framework for people to be able to express themselves. Have you given up on that? Is that why you're busy in Tahrir Institute? Have you kind of thought politics is a waste of time now?
I don't think this is the right way to characterize it. But I just want to make a quick comment just as a start to why I'm here today on what happened and the question that you asked initially. I believe the major downfall of us as you call it, young people, and I'd like to ask you, what do you define as young people in this case?
Younger than me. I mean,
well,
most of this audience, I imagine.
Okay, all right, fair enough. We'll leave it at that. But I think the major problem was that the very successful social movement was unable to transform itself to a political movement. And in some senses, even within our communities, people who were at Tahrir Square and the aftermath of Tahrir Square, where we had other various clashes with the state and sometimes with the Brotherhood and so forth, we were unable to provide a political solution to translate that to this, because we created essentially a political vacuum that was later on filled in by actors, state actors, or individual actors. It's not personal, I suppose. Okay, fair enough. That was filled later on by individuals or actors that had different interests than we did. So with that said, I think that I didn't give up on this process, or initially when I left. But I did realize that I wasn't going to achieve individually or within the community that I'm in what I really hoped for. Before the revolution, I was in the United States. And the day it happened, I started packing my stuff and going back to Egypt, and I stayed there for 2 years. But I did realize that there was a point in time where, for me, Hello? Okay, great.
Keep going through it.
All right. There was a point for me where I could be more beneficial studying more what's going on and actually trying to amplify the voices of people who are working hard on the ground, which is something also we lacked internationally.
Adel, they're all pretty glum. What? They're all pretty glum about Egypt. Are you happy?
I think the future of Egypt definitely, I think we can all agree on, depends on Egyptian youth. But we're focusing our conversation on January 2011. I think you cannot talk about January 2011 without talking about what happened on June 30th.
Then let's see. Hands up. Who says Jan 25th was a revolution? Out of the four. Everyone agree? Okay. Rolling forward to July of a couple of years ago. Who says that was a revolution?
July or June?
July,
yeah, the July.
Definitely a revolution.
It was a revolution?
Definitely.
Who says it was definitely a coup?
July.
Well, yeah.
We cannot put it in simple political
Exactly.
terms.
But that is part of the problem, isn't it? Because when people from the outside look at what's happened in Egypt, they've said either revolution followed by revolution or revolution followed by coup. And the way that everybody outside has pretty much looked at Egypt has been pretty black and white. You know, you had a military regime, then you had a kind of another military regime, but it kept fighting with everybody. And then you had the Muslim Brotherhood who came in, and everyone thinks they were pretty lousy. And then you had the army come in, which basically kind of wound the clock back 10, 20 years in the eyes of many people. And Egypt's kind of done a big 360. So, you know, is that too simplistic? Is that part of the problem, that the world is not seeing Egypt in as enough of a sophisticated way? What do you think, Ibrahim?
I think it's not only the world, I think it's also within Egypt. I mean, trying to reduce the options into either calling it a revolution or a coup is quite problematic, because it dehistoricizes actually what has been happening. And this is part of, I mean, the Brotherhood would insist on calling it a coup because it does not want to see where this is coming from, how they have empowered over the course of over 1 year counter-revolutionary forces. This is the ascent of counter-revolution, which is much worse than a coup. But if you call it a coup, you are not pointing fingers whatsoever to the Brotherhood for their responsibility in facilitating this happening And if you call it, I mean, revolution, then, I mean, as somebody who's interested in social sciences, I cannot understand the idea of just talking about two revolutions within 1.5 years and then just assuming there are two revolutions. I mean, we
Adel,
don't do that.
Tell us then, why is it two revolutions?
We can discuss definitions on the stage. But reality is the Muslim Brotherhood was in power and millions of people went on the streets and wanted them removed. I think what happened in November, I'm assuming you're considering the Muslim Brotherhood was a democratic regime. In November 2013, the Constitution declared...
I'm definitely not assuming that was a democratic regime. I mean, we were all on the opposition side of the Brotherhood, so we have to make things very clear on that.
Look, I mean, we've moved beyond the debate about revolution or coup. I don't think there are these different camps. I think neither camp will be convinced of the other definition. Reality is that youth, this is a panel on youth until today have been relevant. Some people say the youth have been sidelined. I think the political trajectory of Egypt has been shaped by youth. Most of the people that were in the streets on June 30th were youth. The Tamarrud movement that gathered millions of signatures by Egyptians were led by young Egyptians. I think, yes, we would like to see young Egyptians maybe in positions of power, but the question that we should ask, are the young Egyptians really ready to lead? I think what Egyptian youth should be doing now is prepare themselves via education. You're getting a PhD. I'm getting a PhD.
I'm not.
Soon Ramy will get that PhD.
So are you ready to lead, Adel?
We need to be thinking about building and trying to prepare ourselves to be stakeholders. You know,
this kind of reminds me of, in the old days when you used to just kind of say, I'll sort it out in 10 years. I mean, isn't the problem that you've left it in the past to the older generation and they've really messed it up? So isn't it time for you to step up, Ramy?
Look, here's the thing, and I think Adel makes some good points, but however, I disagree with him on one particular thing. I think definitely the youth has been marginalized. And partially because the same reason how you introduced the panel, like how did you disappoint your mom and dad? The patriarchal nature of adults. If you want to call it that.
It's nothing personal.
In any case, let me just go back to a particular point here that's very important. We have been marginalized for sure as youth, and it's been happening systematically and slowly from January 25th all the way to June 30th. Yes, Adel's absolutely right that the majority of people on the street were youth in June 30th, and the majority of people who worked in Tamarrud were youth, and the majority of signatories were youth. You know the reason why? Because majority of Egyptians are under the age of 30. The majority of the population is under the age of 30. We are the majority. We're being talked about as have factional demands, which in fact we are the majority. So when people address, youth this, youth that, we are the people who own the country, not the other generation. So fact of the matter is we actually need to regard the youth, and when we're discussing them, even in panels as such, we need to discuss how is the future going to be shaped, because whether people like it or not, we are the ones who are going to vote.
But he doesn't think you're ready for it. He's saying go and get a PhD, come back in 10 years.
Again, that's another...
No. I mean, the basic idea, after January 2011, you had basically 90 million political scientists. How many of these youths actually studied political science? Everyone needs to focus on something. If you are going to talk about the economy, study economics before you talk about the economy.
But isn't part of the problem
I've seen a lot of youth. I have seen a lot of youth in Egypt. I'm talking as an Egyptian here. A lot of youth complaining, but not providing alternatives, realistic alternatives, solutions. A lot of people are trying to criticize the government on certain issues. We all know their problems. Even the president knows their problems. Everyone in Egypt knows their problems. The question is not to highlight these problems, but to provide answers on how to solve these problems. And until today, many of the youth have still not provided alternatives or solutions to Egypt's problems.
Yeah, but James answered the problem was putting all those youth behind bars.
Guys,
No.
Let's ask Lina, because otherwise it's going to turn into Three Stooges or whatever it is. Lina, you've been listening to the guys having their conversation. It's very Egyptian, isn't it, really? Kind of the conversation moves over to the guys, and then the women are standing there saying, shall I do the work while you get on with it?
Women are very
vision of Egypt is rather strange.
Let's ask Lina. So, it seems that everyone thinks on the panel, well, not everybody thinks on the panel, but largely the youth was marginalized. Adel doesn't think they've taken their chances. We should maybe wait around and see what happens 10 years from now when you're a bit cleverer or a bit more educated, a bit more experienced. Do you think the young people of today in Egypt, and I use that term broadly, are ready to start shaping their country, or should they wait?
I mean, I don't know what does it mean to wait. Waiting is a luxury, really. But at the same time, there has to be an environment in which we can operate. An environment in which we can find alternatives, or in where we can find solutions to the so many problems of the government, rather than complaining. But where is this environment? Right now, and now is different from 3 years ago and from 2 years ago. For me, there isn't even a political space in Egypt that I can talk about. I don't feel, for example, that I have any pressure card that I can use in order to push for my demands, for example. The basic thing, my basic form of engagement as a citizen right now in Egypt is to basically try to support in any form of way the release of my many friends who happen to be in jail. This is how basic my demand has become. I'm not even yearning for better education or better employment or better life. I just want basic life for me and for my friends, and I don't want to risk going to jail just because I work as a journalist nowadays in Egypt. So in order for the youth to be able to find solutions and to be so proactive, there has to be a very basic environment, political environment and political space for this, and this is not even there right now. It's absent. Now, whether we can carve out that space ourselves, like we did back in January 25, which is the product of our agency as youth and as citizens, and the product of the socio-economic issues that Ibrahim referred to. Whether we can go back to that moment is questionable, because there was also bigger reasons on the higher level that made 25 January possible right now. Right now, I would say the conditions are much more different. We are facing an ever stronger state that is speaking the logic of the past. So resisting that state and engaging in contentious politics in the context of that state is a very complex process right now, and that's what we should figure out.
Ibrahim, do you think is that it? Is it been shut down now, the political space for young people?
I agree on the short term, but I think, and this is one very important point, I think, the current regime with its current policy is the furthest, it cannot get any further from being sustainable. There are at least two sets of reasons which make this regime unsustainable. First is the economic. I haven't been there for the economic session, unfortunately. I'm still coming from Washington, but my understanding of the economy is that this is by far not sustainable. You cannot sustain such an economic structure. And the second, which is understudied, the bureaucratic failures of the Egyptian regime. The state has been declining and decaying for over 10 to 15 years, and it is eroding, and it is almost inexistent in so many places of the country, which makes this regime far from sustainable. And any rational political actor in this country should realize that the only path to stability in Egypt is change, and is serious change. And the most important platform for this change is local government on a local level, to challenge this central elitist, authoritarian, systematically.
When you challenge now, you get chucked in jail. So
yeah,
how are you
this
going to
is
get
why
around
I'm
that?
saying that this is a question for those in power, because they would be harmed from the holding on to the existing policies, much as everybody in the country will. Nobody wants to see a complete decay, a complete collapse of the system, because Egypt is, for historical reasons, a country where you don't find strong social institutions that can perform some roles in absence of state. So the presence of state is important. Nonetheless, the existing state is a burden and is not sustainable, and a rapid move towards a new political system in which local government is empowered, and this is a platform for youth, a very important platform for youth engagement and for socioeconomic reforms. This is very similar to an open heart operation, where you need to keep the current, to keep the state living, but also to move very swiftly into a new system. And the current regime is not focusing on any of that, and instead again, with the mentality that it's those people who did the revolution, and in order to make sure that there will be no other wave of revolution, let's just keep accusing them of everything, keep showing. I mean, what happened in Alaa's trial a couple of days ago is a disaster and is shameful. To keep showing, I mean, videos of people in their personal lives in court, to keep taking young people into court
let's
instead
tackle some
of
of
tackling.
Adel, what do you think of the protest law?
Look, Egypt over the past.
Let's not have
Over
that. Without the history lesson, do you
No.
like it? Is it good or is it bad?
There's a rule. My opinion doesn't matter.
No, it does.
You know
I'm
what-
asking your opinion. That's
what-
why you're here.
No, what matters is that there's a rule. If you agree with it or disagree with it, there are avenues.
But hang on. There were rules before the Jan 25th
I agree.
revolution.
I agree with. I
And
agree
you
with the
went out
protest.
onto the streets and complained about them, and you got a new government. So if you'd have had the
So-
rule you've got now, if you'd have abided by the law you have now, you would never have had the Jan 25th revolution.
Look, we
because
have.
you'd have been
My
outraged.
opinion is their protesting is a means to an end. Protesting is not the goal. We want a better life in Egypt. We want Egyptians to be better off. And protest is a tool to be used to inform, criticize, highlight certain things. But protesting is not the goal, it's just a means.
But is it
Now-
should it be a
now-
jailable offence?
I think, say again?
Should it be a jailable offence if you want to have a protest?
Look at the entire region, okay? Look from Syria to Iraq to Libya to Yemen.
Yeah, but you're benchmarking yourselves against catastrophically bad places. Shouldn't you be trying to benchmark yourself against Washington and Paris? And I mean,
No,
isn't
we
that-
have to. I think you need to put Egypt in the context of what's happening in the region. And over the past 3 years, Egypt was in total chaos. And what is the protest law? What it's attempting to do is putting some rules to avoid chaos, avoiding protests. The protests in Egypt were not protests like here in Washington. Even here in Washington, to protest in front of the Egyptian embassy or whatever, like we've seen the brother be doing, you have to inform the authorities.
Yeah, but you don't need to submit the slogans ahead of time. You can gather lots of people. I mean, let me just, quickly question, is it good or bad? Good or bad? The protest law?
I think for the current situation in Egypt, the protest law is good.
What do you think then, Ramy?
Well, I'm try to be as pragmatic as I can be. I do have friends in jail. I have friends who have been affected severely by this protest law. And I think, from a very pragmatic standpoint, I think the protest law definitely needs to be amended. It shouldn't be a jailable offense. Sure, I understand you want to regulate things. I'll try, again, trying to be pragmatic. You want to regulate things? Sure. You want to notify and have protesters notify the authorities? Sure, why not? But the fact of the matter is that people have been trying to notify, in some cases, the authorities, and some permits have been accepted or denied based on the allegiance or the affiliation of the protest. So, but the jailing of protesters is absolutely ridiculous, and I completely agree with you. I mean, there's understandable. I can see Adel's point in the sense of, like, you want to regulate things, you want some adjustment, but to completely be where we are today is an absolute ludicrous situation.
Can I ask you, Lina, I mean, you're a journalist. Is it a scary job these days?
We can get a bit paranoid about it. It's not the easiest job right now.
So how do you get from where you are now? I mean, Ibrahim was talking about building structures and creating a kind of civic society, etc., etc., etc. How do you do that in an environment where if you say the wrong thing or you walk down the wrong road holding the wrong placard, you disappear for a bit?
Yeah, it is a thorny road, but that's what exactly we're trying to do in the newspaper. We created our new structure when it was no longer possible to work in any of the existing mainstream media structures, just because most of the media in Egypt decided to appoint itself as the PR machine of the regime. So it became impossible to operate in any of these media. And hence we had to build our own institution. So I see our experience in the newspaper not just an attempt to do journalism at a time when it's very difficult to do independent journalism in Egypt, but also as an attempt to build the very institutions and to fill this institutional deficit that Ibrahim mentioned at a time when we don't have any other option. How do we do it? We do it by the day. We try to resist our fears. We try to resist our paranoias. Sometimes I actually nervously, inhabit the condition of denial so that I don't start fearing doing things. But I guess crisis is what's managing us. Again, it was inevitable to start a different newspaper. It was inevitable to start thinking on institution in a progressive way. It's an act of inevitability and of crisis that is keeping us moving somehow, especially those of us who decided to stay in, or who don't have an option to leave,
Ibrahim, let me ask you, you talked about needing to build structures. How long is it going to take before you can get to a position where you can mobilize, you can organize, you can feel like you're actually beginning to change Egypt for the better? Is it just a case of treading water until the guys up top give you some space to breathe, or can you actually change things, build things?
The problem is that given the current situation and the current, pressure on as Lina was saying, the absence of political space, there is an absence you cannot simply start organizing. And at moments like that, this is, I think, my most important point. The regime doing that is it's not serving its own purposes. It's not helping itself, it's not sustaining itself. It is basically taking the entire country in a very dangerous direction. If I were to advise the people in power, you should immediately start the only regime capable of sustaining itself in Egypt is a regime that promises and brings serious and deep change to the country. And they don't seem to be doing that.
But let me ask you, Adel, have you got any mates in jail?
Friends in jail? Currently not.
You've all got friends in jail and you haven't. Why do you think that is?
I think maybe I hang out with patriotic Egyptians who are thinking on building.
No heckling, please. The man's got the grace to come on the
on building the country. 55.
No, let him finish.
55% of Egyptians are 25 and younger. We're talking about 50 million plus, and not 50 million people are in jail there. How many are in jail?
Well,
I don't know.
There's a lot.
It doesn't matter.
It's busy.
It doesn't matter.
Look, as a young Egyptian, the only thing I want is to try to build my country, not by just protesting, by criticizing. I try to provide solutions. I try to provide new ideas.
And I promise you, this is what the people in jail have been trying to do as well. Most of them, at least.
Let me ask you a question. Were you protesting in 2011? Were you part of the Tahrir
2011,
protest?
I was in Ohio.
Okay, then mentally,
studying.
were you with the young people in Tahrir Square?
Of course, everyone wanted change. Everyone wanted change.
Did you get the change you wanted? You had a military regime running things, and now you have a military regime running things. Is that the kind of change you were hoping for?
I definitely am not. I wasn't a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. The change that came, the Muslim Brotherhood, was definitely not something that I wanted. And actually, I was supporting of Tahrir, but I was one of the people who thought, logically, I was like, if Mubarak left, what would happen in Egypt? Who would take over more? I gave a speech during that time at my campus in Ohio, and I said I was part of the people who wanted an orderly transition. I wanted Mubarak to finish his term and then have elections. The fact that Mubarak left and then the military took over wasn't what I, at the time, wanted. But this panel is about the future. We can debate the past, there are good things that happen, bad things that happen. But the question is, what
their friends are in jail now. They're not in jail.
Okay, so are we here to discuss what?
We're here.
I have to just respond to one thing here. I think this is part of the problem. Adel's my friend outside of this panel. We went to grad school together, but the fact of the matter is that I think it's part of the intrinsic problem is that we're viewed as, if we have different opinions sometimes, as being unpatriotic. Whether it's Ala or Ahmed Doma, or I'm just listing names that the audience will know, but there are thousands of people are in jail. Some of them, at least a substantial size, did not protest with violence. They protested like we did, like I did personally. I held signs or I was chanting in protest, and I'm sitting right here. I'm out of jail. So the fact of the matter is, no, I disagree with Adel on this particular point that we're definitely patriotic to Egypt. At least I'm not going to speak on behalf of everyone, but I know plenty of Egyptians who are in jail, young, bright folks who have definitely given it their damn best to change Egypt. They, unfortunately, it's very sad to see them now in
Would you mind just a little bit quieter? Sorry. Let me ask you a question. You'll get a chance to object loads and loads and loads. Well, okay, this is a democracy. Okay, thank you. My question was going to be this. There was a lot of hope when the revolution happened. There would be a kind of third front. It wouldn't be the Brotherhood and it wouldn't be the army. There would be this new big political sphere. Why didn't that really come out?
Plenty of reasons. Are we talking again about the kids or the adults now?
I think everything. You know, people were hoping that there would be a different kind of Egypt, one that was built around a whole range of different political parties expressing different views.
Okay, sure. So it'll be very. I mean, there's plenty of reasons, and we have to be very nuanced here. Number one, before the revolution, before January 25th, 2011. There wasn't much space for parties to flourish or to be built and to have the freedom to actually get the time to mature and become real parties. Number two, the transitional process initially after January 25th was rushed extremely fast. You didn't give people a chance to actually build parties and so forth. Third, there was, on the part of the youth, and I feel guilty of it as well, is that we had some moral puritarism in the sense of like we didn't want to work with each other at some points. I think this is our biggest sin. So that also didn't help when you needed to quickly, we needed within, can you imagine not having a party? I'll speak about the party I worked at.
Let me say, so how do you now build that kind of culture of consensus building and compromise and get people to work together?
Number one, the people in power have to allow for it to happen. This is, at least give the space. Let it flourish, okay? I'm sure there's plenty of people on the ground in Egypt that worked in politics or socio-political issues that have learned very valuable lessons since everything started. Just give the parties some time to flourish. Give them, I mean, there are plenty of parties that have been established post the revolution that have good ideas. Sure, they might not have the best reach out there, they might not have the best logistical capacity yet, but you need to give them space, not make them fear for their institution. This is something that, I mean, if you speak to people who still work in parties in Egypt off the record, they'll tell you, like, we're not very sure of our future, right? So you need to have some sort or some semblance of a space where people can vent their views, can actually try to work with other patriotic citizens within the scope of a party, within the scope of an NGO, within the scope of a social group, to offer solutions.
And is that possible? Can that be done in the present situation? Where do you go from here?
I mean, I hope it is possible. I mean, objectively speaking, it is possible. Also, objectively speaking, I mean, the current regime did have, at a certain point at least, enough power and popular support to facilitate such a process with not a very high cost, actually. But it is very short-sighted, self-destructive, and it's not, the problem here is
how do you move forward from where you are now?
I cannot see any way. I mean, there are two paths forward. It's either, I mean, with the absence of political space, so you will see some people trying again to keep working towards opening political space. They might partially succeed. I don't think they will unless there is a real change on the regime side and real opening of political space. And if they fail, they will not fail alone, and that's the real problem here. If they fail, that would lead to, again, with the demographic nature of the country, with the bureaucratic failures, with the economic failures, that would lead to a very bad situation, which, surprisingly, the current regime does not seem to be of observing and is focusing instead on the wrong questions, on whether, I don't know, whether Alaa Abdel Fattah's...
Lina, is there anything that you can see to be optimistic about? And if there is, how do you get to this kind of place where you want to be?
It seems foolish to talk about optimism in Egypt right now, but also it's inevitable to be functional if you decide to stay in Egypt and be engaged in some form or another. So I don't know, call it Ba'akul optimism or whatever you want to call it. Where do I find hope or where do I find optimism? It is in the crisis, actually. So to give you an example, right now we are in this very deep crisis, like I said, which is that basically very close friends of ours, besides also, of course, the thousands of others who are in prison, and it's personal. So we all are coming together, the few of us, the few unpatriotic us are coming together and, trying to find ways to negotiate how we can get these people out of prison through some form of campaigns. We disagree a lot. There is a lot of disagreement. There isn't a consensus like Ramy spoke about, but there is also a lot more alertedness to the need for this consensus, for the need to compromise, for the need to come together and to build. Now, whether this campaign is going to survive or not, in the process of doing it and in the process of negotiating it, we're learning, and we're learning to survive also the crisis, and we're learning not to be silent. And it's in these daily processes that I have a very little piece of hope. Whether I have a hope to change the regime or to change the state, I don't. I think we need to, for me, I think the very political logic in which we're operating is absurd. And for me, the solution is to just go on and read social theory and be happy there, But
do you see a generation, your generation, producing the right kind of leaders to move Egypt forward? The big problem at the beginning was there was no leadership to the revolution. So are you now getting a sense that there are people emerging, that people will coalesce around and will take the country forward?
I've seen in the last 3 years a lot of talent among people of my generation. I don't like identity politics much, but it is the case that I've seen a lot of inspiration from at least the writings, from the thinking of a lot of people around me and of my generation who are functioning on the level of activism or journalism or academia or opinion writing. And they have been extremely inspiring, and they've been putting out propositions that I haven't seen from the elderly in years. Now, whether these people can lead the way, it's a question of new forms of organizing and new forms of institutional building that haven't happened yet. Unless this happens, I'm not sure these youth can manage to transform these very rich ideas they have into tangible political projects to lead the state.
Let me ask Ramy, how do you pull that together? How do you kind of transfer from the ideas, the enthusiasm into institutions that work, that challenge the regime, but also help build the country?
Well, look, I mean, again, as I said, and it's a point that I'm going to stick by, the regime or the government, whatever you want to call it, needs to show some good faith to the youth, in a sense, if we're talking about youth here specifically. It's not going to be hard to, release people from jail. It's not going to be hard to amend a protest law. And then give some political space. I mean, whether we like it or not, you just asked Lina a question about, and Ibrahim and all of us, are we going to produce leaders or not? Well, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to at some point, right? I mean, it's just nature, People are alive, people die, and other people's come to replace them in the age groups, right? So whether we like it or not, it's going to happen. So I think it would be better for Egypt's future if these leaders are prepared and they're allowed to, as an entire generation, to work within with the national system of making Egypt better, on opposed to ostracizing them or alienating them. We're wasting a lot of talent. I mean, the world fell in love with Egypt and in the Arab Spring in general because of the youth. The Egyptian youth excelled in many things like social media and things of the sort. We revolutionized how it's used. So I mean, like this, there's some capital in capitalizing on the youth in Egypt and actually portraying them in a good light, and perhaps having them have their energy and their enthusiasm engaged in how to make Egypt better. But as it stands right now, as you're asking to be very clear about your question, I don't see how the youth can do it. It can't be bottom up right now. I think the government definitely needs to open some space for people to speak their minds and have their demands and let them out and speak and be involved in real politics and social issues.
One of the most disappointing things that's happened is the fact that while women played an incredibly enormous part in the revolutions, they've fared the worst in many ways afterwards. Why did that happen, Lina? What went wrong there? Because
do they have to be a woman answering the question?
No, I'm going to work. You're going to set them up, and then I'm going to knock them down. So you.
I don't think it's again. I'm not big on gender issues and gender politics. Definitely, I think what we've been discussing with regards to the youth in general is also applicable to the women. And again, no space for organizing extremely or like a deeply engraved patriarchal political culture that has that has permeated a lot of decision-making processes by those in power. All of these things have been detrimental to the condition of women, but it's also no different than youth. It's no different than people on the margins. It's the same story, and it needs to be looked at within this larger context.
Ibrahim, do you think your generation will be less patriarchal in the future? Or are they going to kind of go back into bad habits when they get a bit older?
I was hoping it was, but I don't think this specifically is a generational question. I think it has more to do with the socioeconomic structures, and I think it has more to do with the type of, the narrative that's being propagated throughout the media, and what we're having now is definitely not constructive. Look even at the reaction to the sexual assaults on women and how it's being. We're not heading in a good direction in that sense. And unfortunately, again, because the most powerful forces of the country, be it in government or in the now outlawed opposition, are very conservative and patriarchal forces. And this is not changing anytime soon.
And if you don't change that, how does Egypt grow? Because there's a massive latent potential there amongst women in Egypt.
50% of your population will get a better chance in working and walking the streets safely and feeling a sense of pride in being Egyptian and many other things, right? I'm sure many of the audience here know it's becoming very tough for women to just walk on the street sometimes. Not in all areas, but it's a prevalent sexual harassment and the way women are treated in some capacity.
But how do you move the nation on from that? That can't just keep going on generation to
honestly,
generation.
I'm not a sociologist. This is a societal issue, as Ibrahim and Lina were talking also as well. It's a pandemic that needs to be addressed. Also, one of the things that I personally feel as a person, not as an analyst or anything of the sort, I feel that women in Egypt on the national level need better representation. I'm sometimes disappointed in what is being said by the National Council for Women. There are I think women need to definitely be better represented on the national level, for sure.
Adel, how do we get to that stage?
It's a hard question, but nobody would deny that the role of women is very important in the future of Egypt. But I think women today, there's still a lot of things that they need to get. I would say the situation of women today is not the best, but I think women today are better off today than they were under the Muslim Brotherhood. I think many women in the audience, Egyptians, will agree that during the time of the Brotherhood, women did not feel safe. And actually, the president has addressed women and mothers on national TV on several occasions. And I think most of women in Egypt really support the president. And going back to the point that you raised, the third way. I think the third way is being achieved now in Egypt. You're talking about the military and the brotherhood. I think the third way is very clear. It's the Egyptian people. I think President Sisi being elected by 24, 25 million Egyptians is unprecedented in the entire Middle East. No leader in the Arab world has had democratic election. Was elected by 24 million people from its own people. Even Morsi, when he was elected, he only got 12 million. So Sisi had double the support. Even right now with the Suez Canal project, in 5 days, Egyptians put 40 billion Egyptian pounds in the project with all the circumstances, security, economic challenges.
Are you confident that the Egypt you hand to your kids are going to be better than the one your parents handed to you?
Definitely, if the current government continues. President Sisi has been in power for 2 months. He's done so many things on the foreign policy agenda. His visits to Algeria, Africa, what he's been doing with Gaza. If you look at the economy, I would be the first person to acknowledge that there are enormous structural problems. But in 2 months, he's been moving already, trying to address a lot of problems. I think if we're moving in the right direction. If you look at the entire Middle East, there's no success model. If you look, everything is failing. You only have a few potential success stories, and Egypt is one of them. Let it succeed. The United States, for example, was in Iraq for 10 years, and the models that the United States had a chance to build Iraq the way it wanted, it saw theoretically it could build Iraq. Look at Iraq today. So let the Egyptian people, let the Sisi government create its own model. I'm confident that if we move in the direction that we are moving in right now with the leadership of President Sisi, I think that my children, Ramy's children, your children as well,
so let me ask him about.
Will be better off.
None of you have children, I presume, yet. So let's imagine that you do. Lina, are you going to be handing a better Egypt to your offspring?
Not sure about that.
No? Why not? I mean, look, it's only you people that can actually make the difference. So don't you have to have some kind of hope? I mean, isn't that a bit desperate?
I did say that I don't have the luxury of being pessimistic, but I'm being optimistic just to conduct my own life. I have no plan to have children for that very reason, actually. But also, the future is very unpredictable, to be honest. So it's very hard to talk about what kind of Egypt we're going to be handing over to our children. Right now, I agree, the situation is extremely unsustainable, even though for some people, the new administration seems to be proposing a whole new model that is full of hope, that is full of solutions. That's only part of the truth. The bigger truth is that Egypt is sitting on a big deal of unsustainability. The heavily security-oriented approach to ruling is ripe with problems. It is leading a lot of people to either disengage or to feel extremely disgruntled, and this would come back in very scary ways in the near or mid-term, I guess.
Ibrahim, you've talked a lot about how to try and you need some space to build. Are you optimistic that perhaps once the government settles down, maybe if the economy begins to settle down, that they will open up and then you can build something for your kids?
I do not actually believe in all this literature on democratic transitions and checklists. And the Brotherhood was very good on that. I mean, look at the Brotherhood's checklists. They were also very good on checklists. So, yeah, we have the constitution done. We're having, presidential elections. We're looking for the IMF loan. The same government, and again, we hear that same rhetoric. So we've won the presidential elections. That ballotocracy approach, I don't think this is in any ways, this can lead to, because it neglects the very fact that the structures are problematic, and with problematic structures, you can get very good results on paper, but then you're only harming yourself because you're depriving yourself from the ability to see the picture and therefore predict. I mean, nobody, honestly, at least not myself, wants to see chaos in the country. And it's quite problematic that I can only see that the regime, just as much as it keeps reminding us that we're better than Syria and Iraq, is leading us in the very same direction that where Syria and Iraq are today.
Ramy, give me something to hope for.
Well, whether it's going to be good always in Egypt. Look, I have to say I'm a bit pessimistic. But then again, for the largest part of my life, Mubarak was president. I thought he's going to be president until I'm 60. And he's gone now. So again, as Lina said, we don't know what the future holds.
But isn't part of the problem? I mean, when the revolution happened, everyone just kept saying, "This is not good enough. This is not good enough." Isn't there a point when you have to accept that you compromise and you take what you can get and you build and you move forward? Is it perhaps a lack of patience?
Can you elaborate more on your question, because I'm not sure what you're asking to.
What I'm saying to you is that young people are impatient and they want things now. They want to kind of move this and do that. Isn't there a kind of need to say it will take, as Adel was saying, it would take 10 years to get this sorted out. So we'll have a 10-year plan and we'll work slowly rather than thinking it's got to change now.
Sure. I mean, sure, the youth always want things now. I mean, also, but they have needs, a lot of, as the Egyptian society is, young men and women want to get married, and that costs a lot of money, for example, right? They need housing. They need jobs. So if they want to have a kid or two, they need something immediate so they can feed these kids. A lot of them are supporting their parents or their families. They need to feed them right now because you can't wait for food 10 years from now. You can, but it'll be dead. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is, sure, I understand, and again, trying to be pragmatic. Some things will take some time to fix, absolutely. But there are immediate needs that need to be met if you want stability. I mean, I think the rhetoric before 2011. I'm going to, quick anecdote here. I remember when I was a kid, President Mubarak was speaking on TV, and I think it was Labor Day or something, and he was saying, don't aspire to America. Don't aspire to Germany and the UK. I was sitting on my own at home watching it. And, look at France, look at Italy, Greece maybe, and it's that. This is a problem. It's limit your hopes and dreams. Limit your hopes and dreams, and you keep going down and down. How far can you go? I mean, as Lina was saying right now earlier, that my hope right now, my individual hope, again from a pragmatic perspective, is for Egypt to look good. Release the detainees that are not necessarily need to be in jail. My friends are okay, that people are not killed, and they have some semblance of jobs and whatnot. That's all I hope for. I'm sorry, you asked for hope, but it wasn't.
Adel, tell me, I mean, this is a young, educated panel with lots of hopes and ambitions, at least some hopes and ambitions. Why are they also pessimistic, and you've got such a bright future ahead of you in your own eyes? I mean, where's the kind of difference between the two? Why are they so unhappy about where Egypt's going, and you think it's such a fantastic thing to be in?
I didn't say fantastic, but I'm taking a more realistic point of view, not an idealistic point of view. And I'm looking around. I keep saying this, but really, you have to look at Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. I think it's very important for young people to just open the map and look at these countries and look at Egypt. Yes, there are problems, but we can't let things just go. I think also one reason why I'm optimistic to add on the list is that the Muslim Brotherhood is history. The Egyptian people have refused the Muslim Brotherhood. That's another reason for why I'm optimistic. I'm putting things in context. And I had the opportunity to sit with President Sisi, and I can assure you that President Sisi really acknowledges the importance of youth. But Egypt is facing so many challenges that he doesn't have the luxury of trial and fail. He can't try, he needs to succeed. That's his only option.
Okay. So let's open this up to the audience, because I know from the murmur. Oh my goodness, lots of hands. So where's the microphone? There's the microphone. Let me work this way along. Gentleman there at the front. And can I just say, please have a question mark at the end of your sentences.
My name is Mohammed. I'm at NYU, and unfortunately I studied comparative politics and democratization studies. My question for Adel, first of all, I want to congratulate you on your PhD program, and I'm sure that you're going to be like one of the Egyptian officials. The Egyptian state would like to have someone like yours at,
There's a question coming, I can feel it.
My question is, I'm going to be practical with you. I'm leaving my emotional behind me. So you said that you are getting your education and you are trying to provide solution. So can you elaborate more about what kind of solution that you would like to offer for the Egyptian state when you become like a senior leader in Egypt? How Egypt will look like under your consultancy when you become like
I think we've got the gist of that one.
Thank you.
Ladies, gentleman there, just on the edge. I'll take a couple of questions and then we'll move. There you go. Sir with a beard. Well, I guess there's more than one beard.
A lot of beards.
Let's take you first and then we'll go backwards.
Ahmed Badir, Egyptian American, and with an organization called United Voices for America. Obviously, there's a lot of disconnect between the youth, and that seems to be the problem with Egypt today. If they want to see change happen, they're going to have to see eye to eye and recognize that the state is failing. You compare it to the region. Egypt is heading in that direction. And people said, give Nouri al-Maliki some time. He only had 2 months, he had 3 months, he had a year.
Let's get to the
question.
question.
Eventually led to ISIS rising. There's no alternative. The only alternative to democracy and freedom is violence. When you take away democracy and freedom, you end up with violence, and that's the reality. When you don't provide political space...
No one's arguing about what you're saying, but what's the question?
The question is, what will it take for the young people to put their biases aside, their differences aside, their allegiances aside? I heard a lot of Muslim Brotherhood bashing. They're not presented here, and they're all in jail. So they're not the problem anymore. We have to focus on the problem that exists.
Okay,
what will it take for you guys to put your differences aside, work together for the common good of Egypt? which I think has to be based on justice, freedom, and democracy.
Okay, thank you. The chap who thought he was going to get a question, but now is.
Thank you very much. I'm Mohammed. I actually was in Egypt when Mubarak fell and also visited Tunisia. For me, the interesting thing is to see, and nobody referred to Tunisia as an example, those referred to countries that have failed. Why doesn't our panel look into Tunisia, see what it is that we can learn from Tunisia so that we can be more hopeful? Thank you.
Okay, let me move on to this side. Where's the microphone? There it is. Okay, just hum amongst yourselves. Okay, there's. Can we get a lady there? The lady? There we go.
Hi, my name is Wasila. First of all, thank you. It was very interesting to notice your sort of the pessimism going around here, just comparing to the previous panels. My question is, as a young Egyptian person living outside of Egypt, what is the youth doing right now in Egypt to prepare itself for the changes that are coming? We all know that a lot of changes need to happen, but my fear is if Sisi doesn't do enough in 100 days or in 3 months, what happens?
Okay, and one more in the middle, perhaps. There's a guy just standing right in front of you. There you go.
Hi, I'm Chris from AU, and I was wondering if you guys feel that you will get the political space that you've been talking about after the parliamentary elections.
Okay, so why don't we... Adel, you got a very personal question. What's your solution for making everybody happy? Because that chap...
I don't think I have the solution for all the problems in Egypt. I study political science. My focus is on foreign policy, and I have very strong opinions on foreign policy. Last week I had dinner with one of the heads of one of the biggest think tanks here in town, and he asked, what can the United States do to improve the relationship between Egypt and the United States? And my answer was very clear: to stop interfering in domestic politics. I mean, we're having here a discussion on domestic Egyptian politics. Egyptians will determine that. The United States should have, when it comes to Egypt, bilateral relations without interfering in Egyptian domestic politics. So to answer your question, I would be focused on foreign policy. I'm planning, inshallah, in the future to create maybe a think tank to try to enhance decision-making.
It's a very Egyptian answer, isn't it? Hang on. Well, I think isn't it a bit sort of over-Egyptian to kind of keep blaming the foreigners for meddling around and everything? I mean, that's kind of a standard...
I'm not blaming anyone. I'm not blaming the United States. I actually believe that for decades, and I was educated in the United States, I believe that Egypt and the United States should have a good relationship. I'm really a strong believer of that relationship. Okay, the Pentagon and the Egyptian Armed Forces had a good relationship. I'm not blaming, but I think we've reached a point where interfering in domestic politics of another country, it's too much, and it's actually hindering the relationship. I want strong relations between the United States and Egypt.
Okay, let me move on to the next question, which is, I'll ask you, Ramy. The question over there was, why can't you all just get along and
work together? What was the combination about the brotherhood not being represented, and why can't we get along? I actually haven't said one word about the brotherhood so far since we sat here, and I will have to say, why can't we get along? The simple answer is that there are a lot of us were getting to know each other for the first time. There was no large, vast community of, sure, I knew some people in the brotherhood, but I didn't know many of them. I knew some liberals, I knew some socialists, whatever it is, right? So we're getting to know each other. But since January 2011, there's been some rifts between some of these camps that cannot be settled as such. I mean, we're sitting here in lofty seats in Washington, D.C. talking about how can't we get along? I'll tell you why, for example. There was a little conflict called Mohammed Mahmoud in November 2011, where there were clashes between kind of non-Islamist youth with the police or the security forces. On the back end of that, there were some youth from the Brotherhood kind of aiding the police, for example, right? So I personally was there. This is something that doesn't sit well with me. So because I've carried dead people in protests with my own hands. I had a kid die in my hand once, at least. So, I mean, these things are sitting with me as a person. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else here. But this is just a common story that you will hear. The Brotherhood
So is it irreconcilable then? I mean, are these?
Well, that's what I was getting to. So the Brotherhood will have the same also feelings about some other things. Yes, it is reconcilable, but we need to address them in the open, perhaps. Also, it might be reconcilable when people who have been killed get justice, if in some capacity. That also justice provided, justice served, sometimes helps with the grieving process and sometimes helps with reconciliation.
Okay. Can I just ask, there's a question there about Tunisia. Ibrahim, are there lessons to be learned from Tunisia?
I personally don't think that Tunisia is a great model of success either, but and I think it's also quite, when we narrow things down into, okay, so they're having elections, we're still trapped into the question of looking at politics from above without actually seeing the implications of that on people's daily lives, and therefore you lose your ability to predict what's happening in the future. Just need to make one quick comment about the assumption that the Brotherhood is history, which I think is a very false assumption. The Brotherhood could have easily been history. Because there was a very strong sentiment against the Brotherhood, and the organization was at its weakest point on June 30th of 2013. Because, had there been calls for early presidential elections, which is specifically why Morsi did not go for early presidential elections, because the Brotherhood losing it at the will of the people is the one thing that they could have not tolerated, because it really bakes in history. Now there is a love-hate relationship between the Egyptian state and the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood needs the Egyptian state because it needs oppression to justify, to victimize itself and therefore ensure its sustainability and existence. And the Egyptian state needs the Brotherhood, needs that bogeyman to justify its crackdown on people like on activists, on others. And the easy thing to say is, we need this protest law because otherwise we'll have the Brotherhood. We need to crack down on everybody because otherwise we look like Syria and Iraq, because of the Brotherhood. So yes, the Brotherhood could have been history, but the current regime does not want the Brotherhood to be history.
Lina, let me ask you a question. There was a question about whether things would settle down after parliamentary elections. Do you think that would be a kind of moment when Egypt would pause and then start to move forward? Is there some hope in parliamentary elections?
Not necessarily. We've seen a lot of those elements of procedural democracy and instruments of, traditional instruments of democracy taking place in Egypt in the last 3 years, and they haven't been necessarily conducive to a better political space or a more open or a more representative political space. I do not think that the parliamentary elections will do that, particularly because they are being fought with the very same logic that we're standing against. So it is a power struggle between the few parties out there that want to have a share in the cake without necessarily caring about representational politics or representative politics. So I don't think it would be conducive to opening up the political space. And with regards to the question of what are the youth doing right now, I think there's a lot of opting out, and I think of opting out as a form of silent resistance in many ways. I think we've witnessed that during the constitutional referendum, at least, and also the presidential elections. That even though we've seen, a relatively high turnout of people going to vote for Sisi, there has been a lot of concerns about the youth not showing up and not being interested in the political process, and that should be disconcerting for whoever is ruling, basically.
Okay, can I add to the numbers? I mean, the numbers don't support what you just said. From the age group of 18 to 40, about 15 million people showed up. That's the numbers that were published. So if you look at 25 million showed up to the polls, 15 of them were from the age group from 18 to 40, which I would consider young people. So the young people are
not a majority anyway. So
let's give there's a lot of questions out there. So any more questions that I can get to? Where's the microphone at the moment? Okay, let's go to the back, shall we? No, there's nobody at the back. Okay, this lady down here, in the middle.
We're talking about 55% of the youth. Clearly, there's not going to be some sort of consensus. We started off this panel with this hippie revolutionary ideology, and I'm not seeing that sort of cohesion represented in front of us. And so I'm curious as to what types of different tactics you have to use to reach the youth, as opposed to the sort of narrative that we've been talking about, where it's the youth versus age. What sort of different procedures do you have to use to reach your peers?
Okay, thank you. There was another question right next to you from the. Do you want to pass it along?
Yeah, we've been talking about. Sorry, I'm Stephanie. I'm from American University as well. So there was a comment made that 50 million youth are all coming out for this, and not everyone has studied political science or economics. So how can they possibly criticize the political science or the economic side of things? So in this age of technology, when everybody has a voice, how do you propose to form an inclusive government when everyone has an equally loud voice?
Okay. There's a guy over there waving his hand furiously. He's either telling me to wrap up or he's asking for a question. I think it's a question. It's going to run down the back. Oh. Give him the microphone. We'll get a quick question from you, and then we'll...
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with the United States of Africa 2017 project. I assume there are 30 million Egyptians who are between the age of 11 to 21. Do political education on that segment, and then the government will be responsive, any government in Egypt.
I didn't hear a question in that, really, but anyway. Chap there.
Good afternoon. I'm a student from Georgetown University. And the question I had was, in terms of the time that President Sisi has been in charge, as Mr. El-Adawy suggested, it's only been about 2 months. So the one question I have for the panel is criticizing the president to this degree necessary in 2 months? Should he be given more time before a judgment is made of whether or not he was effective? And then what specific policies could President Sisi enact that perhaps the youth could suggest to basically position Egypt to become all that it can be moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you. And chap there in the blue shirt.
My name is Amin Mahmoud. I'm with the Center of Egyptian-American Relations. For Ramy and Ibrahim, you asking if the regime will give you space. The regime will never give you space unless you take it. We have a military ruling. They wear in a suit like you, and they controlling the politics, they controlling the economy.
Question?
That's why the economy is in bad shape. How you can get together, regardless of the problem we mentioned, you have to get along with everybody to take the country back from the military,
what's the
which
question?
they have to be. I'm asking how you will do that. Right. How you will get together to get rid of the military to rule economically and politically.
Okay, I think we've got the... So let's Lina, can I ask you, that was an interesting question there about everybody's got a voice with Twitter and Facebook and everything else. So how do you rule in a way where everyone's just sounding off and it's really hard to get any sense of consensus because there's so many voices out there?
I mean, I don't know why there is so much anxiety about us agreeing on the same thing. Basically, practicing politics is about managing differences and managing divergences. So again, the question goes back to the extent to which there is an environment that is accepting to these differences, and where the concept of patriotism is not basically a notion of privatizing what does it mean to be allegiant to your country, right? So long as this culture doesn't exist, and especially at the rulers' level, I'm not sure how much technology or anything can help, really. So I hold those in power responsible. Definitely we have a responsibility of being in a position where we should be more tolerant, more understanding. I do think that being overtly ideological can be limiting to imagination. But again, this is only part of what should happen.
Okay. Let me ask you that question about tactics. What tactics can you use to actually make a difference, get the young people to kind of put forward policies and try and get them taken on by the government?
If I were in power, the best thing to do again is what, in my view, is what I said earlier about just challenging the very nature of the Egyptian state, the central elitist authoritarian nature of the state, and decentralized through the empowerment, but decentralized not in the neoliberal sense. I mean, decentralized through the empowerment of local government, the empowerment of people's control, giving people control over their daily lives through assigning more responsibility, seriously more responsibility to the local government. The Constitution, the constitutional amendments have taken us only one step in that direction. I think it is way, I mean, it is not even close to what it should be like, but even that tiny step was not, I mean, nobody's taking it seriously, nobody's even discussing it. That's not on the table.
So, Ramy, we know where we want to be perhaps, but what tactics can you use to get there? What can you do to get this government to actually listen to you and take you on board?
Honestly, I'm sorry, I hate to give a blank answer, but I can't think of ways right now, and that's part of my frustration. On a personal level, that's part of my frustration. But I think we're just going to have to, keep on voicing the opinions of people and amplifying them to the best of our ability. Now, the ways to do so, that could get creative in many different ways. So I can't give you a clear answer on that.
Let me ask you, Adel. I mean, no one seems to the right of you to be able to work out what tactics they can use to get their voices heard. How can they do that?
JFK once said, "Don't ask what the government can do to you." Exactly. What you can give to the country. And I don't think, I mean, the voices of the youth have been heard by many people around the world, not only in Egypt. I think the Sisi government really knows the challenges and have heard the Egyptian youth. I think I urge every one of us, find the problem and start solving it. But the problem is that a lot of people are not solving. They're criticizing, destroying, protesting.
We're solving the problem of getting our friends out of prison, which is actually a very serious problem.
Or trying to do journalism, for example, at a time when it's... So how is that not solving a problem? How is that sitting and not doing anything? Like, what do you suggest we should do, for example?
You said you're doing journalism.
Yes.
Okay. I would...
Should I stop doing it? You think it's better?
No, I'm not saying it, but I'm not... Find a problem and provide...
Freedom of expression is my problem.
Look...
Let him have his...
I think nobody here would say that freedom of expression is something bad. I'm a supporter of freedom of expression. But there are always rules. There is a context. Freedom of expression is a tool to achieve something. I mean, there are rules in traffic, for example. I can just speed. I mean, there are always rules. There's not ultimate freedom. When your freedom starts affecting other people's freedom, I think that's a red line. So the question, I would challenge anyone to say that there's someone saying that freedom is not good. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that we as youth should think how we can solve problems and how can our voices be heard. Write them down. You're a journalist. Write an article. Say this is a problem and this is the solution.
Okay, so I mean, look,
Paul, if I may, just one quick thing here. I mean, I think there's some middle ground here in the sense of Bassem Youssef, for example, was he was expressing himself in freedom of expression, and he's off the air now, based perhaps partially on his choice, but partially also according to his own words, that he was kind of a little bit pressured to take a long break. So I think Lina has a very good point in the sense of I don't think freedom of expression you can plan for it in advance. You can't say, well, I'm going to have freedom of expression for the next 3 months to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's healthy for a country to have freedom of expression permanently.
Well, we've been here an hour and a half, and we've all finally agreed on something, which is that freedom of expression is a good thing, which is what we've had today. Well, pretty much everyone. I want to thank the panel. They were fantastic. And I think even though at least 3/4 of them were very unoptimistic, I think the fact that people like that are running Egypt in the future can give us some optimism. Thank you.
And I just want to step in and thank you all once again for attending our second annual Egypt conference. We look forward to seeing you next year. And please go online and become a member and support more conferences and programs like these. Thank you all for joining today.